In the year 2100, Earth had fallen into complete ruin. Fire and destruction covered the planet, and humanity stood on the verge of extinction. Above the devastated world, a warcraft moved through the sky at sonic speed. Sitting calmly on one of its wings was a mysterious, white-haired man. Looking down at the ruined land below, he quietly muttered that he had finally found the target. Without hesitation, he jumped from the aircraft and descended toward the ground. Meanwhile, below, a young man was running desperately through the destroyed streets. Exhausted and terrified, he called out for help, hoping that anyone, was still alive. Suddenly, a giant hybrid monster appeared in front of him. Before he could react, another horrifying creature emerged behind him. Trapped between them, the young man collapsed to the ground in fear and begged for someone to save him. As tears streamed down his face, he looked at the photograph of his family while the monsters slowly approached him. In his mind, he cursed the creatures that had turned the world into a nightmare and wished for someone to take revenge on humanity's behalf. At that moment, several beams of light descended from the sky. The blast struck the monsters directly and annihilated them instantly. Amid the fading light, the white-haired man landed on the ground beside him. He was Jin, the protagonist. The young man stared at him in shock as Jin apologized for arriving too late. Barely conscious, the survivor grabbed Jin with the last of his strength and asked if humanity could finally take everything back. Jin calmly answered that this was exactly why they had come. But as he spoke, he noticed the young man's severe injuries. Telling him that he could finally rest peacefully, Jin watched as the survivor thanked him through tears before collapsing motionless onto the ground. Jin silently closed his eyes for a moment. Soon after, a black-haired professor wearing glasses approached him. The professor, Kagura, stated that they had failed to arrive in time and explained that the dead survivor was probably the last human left in the entire area. As he adjusted his glasses, Kagura said that humanity was finished. Repeated environmental pollution had triggered sudden mutations that gave birth to monsters known as the Corruptors. These creatures possessed overwhelming regenerative abilities, to the point that even nuclear weapons could not destroy them completely. Even so, humanity continued fighting. They carried out countless human experiments and eventually succeeded in creating a method capable of countering the Corruptors. Kagura let out a sigh and said that there was no one left to save anymore. Humanity had simply been too late. However, Jin calmly replied that there was still someone they needed to save. Kagura questioned whether Jin truly believed there were survivors somewhere in the world. As he walked away, Jin answered with a faint smile that he was not talking about the present, but the future. He reminded Kagura that the nanomachines he created were designed not only to suppress the Corruptors' regeneration, but also to restore Earth's environment. Kagura confirmed that this was true. Jin then said that one day the planet would recover the beauty it once had, and when that time came, another civilization as prosperous as humanity could rise again. Kagura dismissed the idea as nothing more than a dream. Even so, Jin replied that he did not mind. To him, even the smallest possibility was worth believing in. Sometime later, Kagura placed Jin inside a hibernation capsule filled with green liquid. As Jin lay inside the pod, he thought that his power might one day be needed again. Perhaps believing in a small possibility was what could save the future. All he needed to do was preserve that chance. Before leaving, Kagura looked at Jin one final time and activated the cold sleep system. Soon after, human civilization was almost completely erased from Earth. Mutated beasts and massive titan-like monsters spread across the planet and overwhelmed everything in their path. As thousands of years passed, the monsters continued mutating, becoming larger and more destructive. However, after even more time passed, the mutations began to reverse. The creatures gradually became smaller, weaker, and more fragile before slowly dying out. Millions of years later, Earth had fully restored itself. Greenery once again covered the planet. Rivers and oceans became clear, and small, peaceful creatures spread across the world. The scene then shifted to 1 billion years later. Inside the hidden facility, Jin's hibernation pod activated and announced that the access key had been confirmed and the cold sleep sequence was being initiated. By this point, humanity had evolved once again. A brown-haired mutant girl was desperately running through the ruins alongside her companions while a giant monster chased them. As they fled, her overweight companion nervously questioned whether the person they were searching for was truly in this place. The brown-haired girl firmly insisted that he was. At the same time, her blue-haired companion warned that if they were wrong, all of them would die there. Even so, the brown-haired girl continued running forward, convinced that the guardian god was definitely there. Moments later, she opened the door to the chamber containing Jin's hibernation pod and rushed inside. Her companions followed behind her in panic after realizing that the room was a dead end. The girl suddenly stopped after seeing the pod before her. At that moment, the giant monster entered the chamber and slowly approached them. Terrified, the blue-haired girl asked what they were supposed to do now. Both companions collapsed to the ground in fear, but the brown-haired girl remained standing and desperately pleaded for the guardian god to save them. Suddenly, the glass chamber of the hibernation pod shattered open. A voice from inside calmly answered that her wish would be granted. In the next instant, a beam of light shot from the pod and pierced through the monster's head, killing it instantly. The three children stared in shock before finally feeling relieved. Then Jin stepped out from the broken pod with one hand raised, dark energy swirling around his palm. Looking at them, he quietly remarked that believing in the possibilities of the future had truly been worth it. Jin soon realized that the supply system his friend had prepared was still functioning perfectly. After opening one of the storage compartments, he found his clothes preserved exactly as they had been before he entered cold sleep. Looking through the remaining monitors, he discovered that 100 million years had passed since he was sealed inside the pod. Much of the facility's stored data had been lost over time, yet the underground shelter itself remained surprisingly intact. After finding a tech injector nearby, Jin concluded that the nanomachines had helped preserve the structure throughout the ages. Holding a message cube in his hand, he wondered what had truly happened to Earth during all those years. He then turned toward the beast-like children and asked them to explain their story while they hid inside the chamber. The children were shocked to realize that their savior had apparently spent all that time sleeping without clothes. Ignoring their reactions, Jin calmly changed into his preserved outfit before finally preparing to leave the ancient underground base. After adjusting his gloves and long coat, he quietly remarked that the appearance suited him perfectly. Soon, the massive metal doors slowly opened, allowing bright sunlight to pour into the shelter. Accompanied by the children, Jin stepped outside while shielding his eyes from the sun. What spread before him was no longer the ruined Earth he remembered, but a vast green paradise filled with life. Looking across the peaceful landscape, he reflected on how completely the planet had changed over 100 million years. The world had become almost unrecognizable. As they walked, the little girl once again referred to him as the protector god before asking him to follow her through the open fields. Watching the children closely, Jin began thinking about their existence. Humanity should have disappeared long ago, yet these beings looked remarkably human despite their animal-like features. He wondered whether they were descendants of humanity or entirely new creatures that had evolved over countless years. After observing them further, he concluded that the nanomachines likely influenced their speech and development. Realizing he had not introduced himself yet, Jin finally gave his name as Shidō Jin. The brown-haired girl introduced herself as Hakama Phil, while the chubby boy called himself Dampo, and the cat-like boy introduced himself as Shandy. Jin then asked where they were heading, and Hakama explained that they had almost reached their destination. She also asked him to defeat the Corruptors, surprising Jin after hearing that ancient name once again. At that moment, Shandy suddenly panicked after spotting something in the distance. Ahead of them, the children's village was engulfed in flames beneath a dark, cloudy sky. Horrified, the children rushed toward the burning settlement while calling out for their parents. Jin attempted to stop them, but quickly realized the danger was real. As he observed the village carefully, he noticed that it was protected only by rough wooden barricades. The burning structures and desperate atmosphere made him realize that this civilization was far less advanced than humanity had once been. Suddenly, Hakama froze after witnessing a terrifying scene nearby. An elderly woman was desperately fighting against a giant insect-like monster in an attempt to protect the village. Struggling to hold the creature back, The old woman demanded to know why the children had returned to such a dangerous place. From a distance, Jin carefully examined the monster and immediately noticed its resemblance to the original Corruptors from his era. Realizing the creature was nearly identical to the enemies from the past, he became cautious. At that moment, Hakuma's body began glowing with green light as she declared that she would save everyone. Wanting to confirm his suspicions about the children's strange powers, Jin stepped forward. In a single precise movement, he struck the creature with overwhelming force and sent it flying away. He then caught the elderly woman before she could fall and politely apologized as he took over the battle. Meanwhile, Hakuma gathered an enormous amount of energy in her hands. Jin encouraged her to attack, and the young girl released a massive fireball toward the monster. The blazing attack struck the creature directly and caused a violent explosion that completely destroyed the insect's head. As Jin observed the corpse, he realized that the creature's regeneration had been neutralized by nanomachines. Intrigued, he wondered how Hakuma had managed to use the technology, since compatibility had always been necessary in the past. He asked whether everyone possessed that ability, but the elderly woman explained that only a small number of people could use it. Their people refer to the power as divine power. Hearing this, Jin finally began to understand the situation. Soon after, the boys rushed over, and the older one scolded the elderly woman for returning to the village alone. With a sorrowful expression, the woman admitted that their hometown was already doomed. She then revealed that the creature they had just defeated was only a newborn hatchling, causing the atmosphere around them to grow tense. According to her, the true monster was far stronger, and an entire swarm of hatchlings would soon attack the village. Just then, a young warrior arrived and confidently told everyone not to give up hope. Holding a sharp spear in his hand, he boldly declared that he could defeat the monsters by himself. Relieved to see the children safe, the elderly woman asked about the other villagers. The young warrior assured her that everyone had already taken shelter. Soon after, Hakuma's father rushed forward and tightly hugged his daughter, admitting how worried he had been after she disappeared. Hakuma confessed that she had gone to the sealed door, shocking the elderly woman with her recklessness. At that moment, Shandy pointed toward Jin and proudly declared that he was the guardian god spoken of in legends. Jin, however, remained focused on the enormous beast approaching from the distance. The arrogant young warrior dismissed the claim, mocking Jin as someone from an inferior race without any animal powers. He insisted that defeating the hatchlings earlier had only been luck. Hakuma immediately defended Jin, but the young warrior simply laughed and boasted that he could eliminate weak monsters like those himself. Jin stepped forward and calmly asked everyone to listen carefully, but the young man raised his spear and warned him not to interfere. According to him, the village had no need for help from weak outsiders. Ignoring Jin completely, the warrior walked past him and declared that he would defeat the giant beast alone. When one of the adults asked where he was going, the young man confidently answered that he was going to hunt the monster himself. Shandy trembled nervously, while the elderly woman angrily remarked that the foolish boy could have survived if he had simply run away instead. Throughout the argument, Jin stayed silent and carefully observed the villagers and their behavior. The elderly woman eventually thanked him for helping earlier and begged him to take the children to safety inside the shelter. However, Hakuma surprised everyone by insisting that she would follow the warrior into battle. Jin then stated that he had no intention of running away either and declared that he would personally take the lead in the fight. Hakuma looked at him with admiration, sensing the confidence and pride carried by the legendary warrior. Jin calmly added that he would not allow anyone to call him weak, while recklessly throwing their own lives away. Soon, a gigantic creature covered in countless horrifying eyes emerged from the shallow water nearby. The young warrior clenched his fists with determination before stepping forward to confront it. Electricity began crackling around his body as he proudly proclaimed himself the protector of the village. Pointing his shining spear toward the creature, he vowed to destroy the intruder. Without hesitation, he leaped high into the air and charged directly at the monster. The abomination merely stared at him while strange slime dripped from its body. Moments later, more masses began rising from the muddy water, revealing two smaller offspring accompanying the giant creature. The warrior quickly spun his spear and formed an electric barrier around himself before preparing his strongest attack. Wanting to end the battle in one strike, he unleashed a massive beam of lightning toward the giant beast. The attack slammed directly into the creature's face and caused heavy damage. Believing he had won, the young man landed confidently with a smug smile. But as the smoke cleared, the monster remained standing. To his horror, the massive wound on its face began regenerating at incredible speed. Seeing this, the feline warrior lost all confidence and froze in shock. Without mercy, the creature raised a massive claw and swung it down toward him. Terrified, the boy shut his eyes and waited for death. At that instant, Jin appeared in front of him and blocked the attack with a technological shield. The young warrior stared in disbelief after realizing he had been saved. Jin immediately moved past him and launched a powerful energy slash at the creature. Even after taking the attack directly, however, the giant beast still remained standing. Seeing this, Jin raised his hand and activated another ability. A massive beam of destructive light pierced through the monster's chest and inflicted severe damage. The young warrior stood speechless while the villagers screamed in panic from a distance. Jin then ordered everyone to get away from the area immediately. The elderly couple watched the battle in complete shock, unable to understand the overwhelming power the stranger possessed. Suddenly, the giant creature lifted its enormous arm and prepared to crush both Jin and the young warrior with a single strike. Without hesitation, Jin grabbed the boy and instantly retreated at high speed. A moment later, the monster's attack slammed into the muddy ground where they had been standing, creating a massive impact. Jin landed safely nearby and placed the stunned feline boy back on the ground. Still shaken, the boy stared at Jin and asked who he truly was. Jin did not answer. Instead, he silently watched as the abomination regenerated all of its severe injuries within seconds. Jin explained that special technology was required to stop the monster's regenerative abilities. Looking at the feline boy, he realized that the people of this era referred to that technology as divine power. He complimented the boy's electric attack, but calmly pointed out that the strike had not penetrated deeply enough to completely destroy the creature. Still overwhelmed by everything he had witnessed, the boy nervously asked whether Jin was a god. Jin simply replied that he did not remember being one. Approaching the young warrior, Jin reminded him of something important. Earlier, the boy had insisted that the monster was the village's problem alone. The feline boy became irritated by Jin's attitude, but Jin turned his attention back toward the giant creature and calmly declared that the monster had now become his problem instead. At that moment, the abomination suddenly attacked with its massive tail. Jin effortlessly dodged the strike and glided across the shallow water with ease. Maintaining a calm expression, he decided to immobilize the creature first. A glowing shield formed around him and blocked another tremendous impact without difficulty. The giant beast rose from the water and roared furiously. Jin explained that creatures like these have been born from humanity's countless mistakes. As he spoke, powerful electric energy gathered around his clenched fist. He then revealed that he came from 100 million years in the past, which was why he carried such a heavy burden. Preparing another devastating attack, Jin stated that he alone was capable of resolving this problem. The feline boy, still shaken, asked if defeating the monster was truly possible. Jin calmly assured him that it was. In that instant, memories flashed through Jin's mind. Ancient knights fighting endless wars, modern soldiers dying in catastrophic conflicts, and scientists conducting painful experiments in desperate attempts to save humanity all passed before him. The result of that long history of suffering was Jin himself, the final scientific weapon humanity had ever created. With that resolve, Jin unleashed his full power. A massive beam of white energy erupted from his hand and struck the monster directly. The force completely overwhelmed the creature, freezing it in place before vaporizing its entire body. From the distance, the villagers stared in disbelief at the overwhelming destruction. Hakamo watched with admiration, unable to hide her excitement. The attack was so powerful that the beam pierced through the clouds and became visible even from space. Once the smoke faded, nothing remained of the creature except a glowing green puddle. The feline boy broke into a cold sweat after finally understanding the enormous gap between his own strength and Jin's. Dusting off his hands calmly, Jin declared that he was the last one left, and introduced himself as humanity's final scientific weapon. As peace slowly returned to the sea, Jin quietly observed the calm surroundings. Nearby, however, a girl wearing glasses was secretly hiding in the bushes. She had come to investigate the mysterious intruders. Using a special lens device, she was shocked by what she witnessed, realizing that not even the captain of the Knights possessed such power. Watching Jin from up close made her heart race with excitement, and she quickly decided to return to the royal capital to report everything she had seen. Later that night, inside a dark forest, Jin activated a cube-shaped device that projected a holographic message left behind by Kagura. The scientist smiled and admitted that he had always wanted someone to speak with after his death. He asked Jin how the future world looked and assumed that nature had finally recovered. However, Kagura's expression soon became serious. He warned Jin that even if Earth itself healed, the mutant monsters would not simply disappear. Hearing this, Jin silently listened with a grim expression. Kagura then revealed that he had noticed something unusual 1,000 years after Jin entered cold sleep. In order to observe the planet's changes himself, Kagura had also placed himself into deep hibernation. As the environment improved, the number of monsters gradually decreased. But while monitoring the world, he discovered a new threat beginning to emerge. The holographic images displayed a mysterious purple-haired being standing beside a fallen creature. Unlike the old monsters, this new species appeared far more intelligent and dangerous. Kagura explained that the monsters had continued evolving alongside Earth's recovery, creating far stronger mutants that would become a major threat in the future. Because of this, he decided to share some of the planet's energy with the new life forms so they could fight back against those evolving creatures. In addition, Kagura had prepared one final gift for Jin. Confused, Jin looked at the glowing cube in his hand before opening it and discovering a syringe filled with bright green liquid inside. Without hesitation, he injected the substance into his arm. Immediately, his body began glowing with powerful energy, as he was the only person fully compatible with the technology. Jin silently stared at his hands while feeling the new power flow through his body. Moments later, a bright technological blade materialized in his palm. Realizing that he could now create weapons directly through the nanotechnology, Jin acknowledged how useful this new ability would become. Kagura's hologram continued explaining that he had hidden more upgrades like the recent one inside secret facilities scattered across the world. He intentionally spread them out so enemies could never destroy everything at once. However, he admitted that another reason was to force Jin to travel across the planet and experience the new world for himself. The scientist then spoke about the distant future and the dangerous threats that still existed. Even so, he pointed out that the world had improved far beyond the hopeless age they once lived in. Kagura recalled how humanity's final years had been filled with despair, fear, and endless destruction. But now, people could walk freely through forests without constantly fearing death. Villages and cities had been rebuilt, peace had slowly returned, and children could finally grow up safely in their homes. Smiling warmly, Kagura told Jin to enjoy the world they had managed to preserve. As the hologram began flickering, the scientist admitted that he regretted not being able to witness the end of the journey himself. His appearance gradually aged, showing the toll of the years he had dedicated to the project. Jin silently watched the final moments of his closest companion with sadness. With his last words, Kagura entrusted the future of the planet to Jin before the message finally disappeared. Jin quietly stored the cube away, accepting the responsibility left to him. Soon after, the Beast children came running toward him while calling out excitedly. Out of breath, they explained that everyone in the village had been searching for him because the celebration could not begin without their savior. Jin was slightly surprised by such a warm reception. However, while speaking with them, he noticed a glowing pendant hanging around Hakuma's neck. Curious, he asked where she had gotten it. The young girl explained that it was a treasured heirloom passed down through generations within her clan. According to her, the pendant was meant to summon the protector god whenever the village faced great danger. Hearing this, Jin finally understood how he had been awakened. That night, the entire village gathered around a large bonfire to celebrate their survival. Villagers laughed, drank together, and invited others to join the festivities. When Jin arrived, some villagers nervously asked whether he was truly the legendary guardian god. Others, however, still mocked him for appearing to belong to an inferior race without animal traits. The feline boy immediately became furious after hearing the insults. He marched over to the group and kicked one of the men to the ground, shouting that they had run away during the battle and therefore failed to witness Jin's overwhelming power. Unlike before, the children now looked at Jin with complete admiration. Soon, Hakuma's father and the village elder approached Jin personally. The elder thanked him on behalf of the entire village and admitted that everyone there would have died without his help. Because of this, they wished to repay the debt they owed him. Jin calmly smiled and told them not to worry about repayment. However, since they insisted, he asked for information instead of material rewards. He wanted to understand the current state of the world. His request confused the village leader, but the elderly woman soon suggested that he travel to the royal capital if he truly wanted answers. She explained that the kingdom was ruled by King Cormoja and that the capital was the center of knowledge and trade in the region. The villagers themselves often traveled there to sell special fabrics made from silkworms. Although the journey was long and dangerous, the old woman believed the protector would have no trouble surviving it. She also asked Jin to take Hakuma with him because the girl needed to travel to the capital as well. Since Hakuma could use divine power, she was supposed to enroll in an academy that trained people with such ability. After hearing that, Jin realized that even in this era, schools still existed. At that moment, the feline boy approached them and raised his hand, insisting that he should be the one to guide the guardian god. The elderly woman immediately shut him down, saying that he had no business going to the capital. However, Sauls arrogantly laughed and declared that he was heading there to join the Holy Knights. The elder reminded him that he could not even enter the academy, so there was no chance the Holy Knights would accept him either. Hearing that, Sauls furiously clenched his fist and shouted at her to repeat what she had just said. Before the argument could continue, Jin stepped in and asked whether possessing holy power alone was not enough to join. Hakuma explained that there was also a written exam, and since Sauls was an idiot, he had failed it. Jin calmly nodded in understanding, though inwardly he became interested in the Holy Knights. Meanwhile, deep within a distant forest, a blonde knight stood beside his horse in shock after hearing that the massive corruptor near Kodama village had already been defeated. The girl with glasses, who had been spying on Jin earlier, confirmed that the report was true and explained that she was on her way back to inform the guildmaster herself. Hearing that, the blonde knight thought to himself that he had rushed there because he believed not even a holy knight could defeat such a creature. He had not even waited for the guild's official report, yet the monster had already been taken down before his arrival. The girl then smiled and commented on how unbelievable it was to encounter a holy knight in such a remote place. However, before she could continue, a monster suddenly leapt out from behind her and lunged forward to attack. In an instant, the blonde knight drew his sword and cut the creature cleanly in half with a single strike. After eliminating the monster, he turned toward the girl and said that if her story was truly accurate, then this person had become very interesting to him. With a faint smile, the blonde knight declared that he now wanted to meet this mysterious individual himself. The following morning, the peaceful village welcomed a bright and calm day. Jin stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air while admiring the beautiful scenery around him. Looking across the landscape, he quietly reflected that he had never imagined seeing Earth become this beautiful again. At the same time, he sadly wished Kagura could have witnessed this restored world as well. Soon, the feline boy approached him while carrying a new set of clothes and once again referred to him as the guardian god. Embarrassed, the boy quickly told Jin to get dressed properly instead of walking around half-covered. Once everything was prepared, Jin and Hakuma began getting ready for their journey to the capital. Before they departed, the elderly woman reminded Hakuma to guide Jin carefully throughout the trip. The young feline warrior complained that he wanted to join them too, but his grandmother ordered him to focus on his studies first. Before leaving, Jin complimented the boy's fighting skills from the previous battle. The feline boy instantly turned red with embarrassment before proudly declaring that he would train hard and wait for Jin in the capital someday. Hakuma's father then thanked Jin sincerely and entrusted his daughter's safety to him, warning that the roads ahead could be dangerous. Finally, after exchanging their goodbyes with the villagers, Jin and Hakuma left the settlement together and began their long journey toward the royal capital. Hakuma ran excitedly ahead while Jin followed at a calm pace. The two traveled along a trail beside a sparkling river surrounded by dense greenery and peaceful scenery. By evening, they stopped to rest near a beautiful mountain waterfall. Hakuma happily pointed toward the horizon, showing Jin the breathtaking landscape around them. Later that night, the two sat beside a small campfire. Hakuma mentioned that the royal capital was still 4 days away, though Jin quietly thought the distance did not seem very far. Curious, the little girl asked why he wanted to learn so much about the current world and once again referred to him as the guardian god. With a faint smile, Jin replied that it was a secret. At the same time, he recalled Kagura's warning that the Corruptors would never truly disappear. The image of the bizarre monsters from earlier crossed his mind again, confirming that they still existed in this era. However, Jin knew those creatures were originally supposed to appear only in heavily polluted environments. Suddenly, he sensed a strange energy nearby. His expression became serious, causing Hakuma to nervously ask why he suddenly looked so frightening. Jin quickly apologized and explained that he had simply been thinking about an important problem. Even so, he felt relieved knowing that there were still people living freely outside the control of those monsters. For now, he decided that his first priority would be learning how humanity in this era dealt with the Corruptors. Soon after, Jin asked Hakuma to stop calling him a god and formally introduced himself simply as Jin. At that moment, the sound of galloping horses shattered the silence of the night. Both Jin and Hakuma immediately became alert as several riders approached them. Hakuma grew nervous when a blond man riding at the front calmly apologized for interrupting their rest. Mounted on a large horse and dressed in shining armor, the knight politely asked whether he could speak with Jin for a moment. Sitting calmly by the fire, Jin asked who he was. The man introduced himself as Argus Walton, captain of the 7th Division of the Royal Knights. Hearing the title, Jin quietly wondered whether these knights might be the people he had been searching for. However, one of Argus's female companions immediately became irritated by Jin's relaxed attitude. She angrily ordered him to stand and show proper respect to her captain. Before the situation escalated further, Argus calmly stopped her and apologized for his subordinate's behavior. Maintaining a polite smile, he invited Jin to continue speaking peacefully. Jin stood up and asked what the knight meant by her earlier accusation. Argus then questioned where the two travelers had come from and where they were heading. Hakuma answered honestly that they had departed from Kadama village and were traveling toward the royal capital. The female knight immediately assumed they were lying. Smiling coldly, she dismounted her horse and drew her sword, preparing to attack. She insisted there were no official records matching Jin's identity and accused the pair of being suspicious outsiders. Jin was surprised to learn that this kingdom maintained such detailed records. However, Argus soon interrupted his companion and explained that Hakuma's story was believable. According to him, the fabric of her clothes was unique to Kadama village and extremely difficult to fake. Hearing this, the female knight fell silent in embarrassment. Still, Argus's expression soon turned serious again. Gripping the hilt of his sword tightly, he pointed the blade toward Jin and explained that the problem was not Hakuma, but Jin himself. The captain questioned Jin's unusual clothes and asked where they came from. He also revealed that bandits often used children to lure travelers into traps along dangerous roads like this one. Because of that, Argus suspected they might be criminals pretending to be harmless travelers. Hakuma immediately shouted that they were not bandits, but Argus calmly replied that he would decide the truth himself. Frightened but determined, Hakuma prepared to defend Jin. Green electrical energy began glowing from her hands as she readied her divine power. Argus carefully observed the energy surrounding the girl and warned her not to do anything reckless. Meanwhile, the other knight stared in shock after realizing how much potential Hakuma possessed. Throughout the tense confrontation, Jin remained completely calm. Argus then raised a glowing crystal and acknowledged that the pair clearly possessed unusual strength. Pointing his sword directly toward Jin's face, he demanded a proper explanation about his origins and warned that he would kill him if the answer proved unsatisfactory. Without showing the slightest fear, Jin calmly looked at the blade before taking a deep breath and stating that he also came from Kadama village. The female knight was completely confused by the unexpected answer. Argus, however, seemed to understand something immediately. Lowering his weapon, he turned toward Hakama and asked whether she had lied at any point during her explanation. The little girl firmly confirmed that everything she said was true before asking if Jin really was the legendary guardian god of her village. Argus fell silent for a moment while processing the information. Finally, he asked whether their discussion was finished, and Jin calmly confirmed that it was. The captain then mounted his horse again and apologized for the misunderstanding, leaving his companion completely shocked. Before departing, Argus explained that they were also traveling toward the royal capital and stated that they would likely meet again soon. He even offered to repay the debt for the trouble they had caused, while his furious companion loudly protested beside him. After announcing their departure, Argus and the other knights rode away into the night. The female knight still could not understand why her captain had suddenly backed down. Watching them leave, Jin quietly smiled to himself. As they traveled, the angry knight insisted that the stranger had been suspicious from the start and once again referred to Jin as an inferior race. Hearing those words, Argus fell silent for a moment before questioning who the real inferior one actually was. His response left the woman confused, while another knight calmly agreed with him. The brown-haired knight was shocked by their reaction. One of the knights then asked whether she truly had not noticed what happened during the confrontation. According to them, the difference in power between their group and Jin had been overwhelming. Argus finally revealed that he had secretly attempted to attack Jin at least 3 different times during their conversation. The scene replayed in his mind as he pointed his sword toward the white-haired man. Each time he tried to activate his divine power, his hand trembled violently, while Jin's glowing hand effortlessly neutralized the attack before it could even begin. When his companion asked whether he had really used divine power, Argus confirmed that he had. The knight was stunned after realizing that Argus's abilities had been completely suppressed without Jin even visibly responding. Argus explained that he had attempted to use the same spirit-based techniques as Hakama, but the spirits simply refused to obey him. Another green-haired knight admitted that the same thing had happened to her as well. Hearing this, the others realized there was an enormous gap between their divine power and Jin's abilities. Argus calmly concluded that only the captain of the Holy Knights might possibly rival someone like him. The brown-haired knight grew even more irritated after hearing such praise directed toward Jin. Frustrated, she admitted that she had not sensed anything unusual at all. Argus explained that Jin was an anomaly and that her lack of experience as a rookie prevented her from noticing it. He then added that Jin was most likely the one who defeated the giant monster near Kadama village. Although the female knight still insisted that Jin was dangerous, Argus stated that he intended to keep observing him for now. As the group continued toward the royal capital, one of the knights reminded everyone that they needed to return quickly. Meanwhile, Argus quietly reflected on the so-called guardian god and his overwhelming strength. Looking toward the distant capital, he began considering how valuable someone like Jin could become if he ever chose to stand beside the kingdom. The following day, Jin casually mentioned to Hakama that they had encountered some interesting people the previous night. Hakama then explained that the group they met belonged to the elite Holy Knights. According to her, their captain's spiritual magic was on an entirely different level compared to ordinary warriors. She further explained that divine power originated from spirits, while the techniques themselves were considered magic. Listening carefully, Jin finally realized that the so-called spirits of this era were actually nanomachines. To him, advanced science had gradually transformed into something resembling fantasy over millions of years. As he thought back to being called an inferior race, Jin quietly repeated the phrase aloud. Confused, Hakama asked what he meant. Jin commented that there seemed to be many different species living in this world now, and Hakama agreed. She explained that some races resembled fish, while others had insect-like traits. According to stories passed down by her grandmother, habitable regions had once been extremely limited. Over countless generations, people altered and evolved their bodies to better survive in different environments. Jin was surprised by the explanation and quickly realized that humanity had adapted over millions of years in order to survive. He then asked whether people who had not evolved were considered inferior races. Hakama sadly confirmed that this was true. Since they were viewed as weak, such people were often mistreated or even sold. The revelation shocked Jin. Hakama, however, admitted that she personally found it strange to judge someone simply for being different. Hearing her honest thoughts, Jin smiled and told her that she was a genuinely good person. Hakama became slightly embarrassed and confused by the compliment. Suddenly, the sound of massive footsteps interrupted their conversation. Moments later, a blue-haired girl appeared from the forest and desperately begged them for help. While running toward them at full speed, she suddenly lost balance and collapsed heavily onto the dirt road. Hakama quickly rushed over to help her and asked whether she was all right. Jin carefully observed the unconscious girl lying on the ground. She was covered in scratches and dirt, breathing heavily from severe exhaustion. He also noticed that her ears resembled those of an elf. After examining her condition more closely, Jin realized that her injuries were serious. Hakama gently lifted the girl's head onto her lap and tried to wake her with concern. Jin then stated that he would heal her and created a bright blue light in his hand. However, the moment the injured girl opened her eyes, she reacted instantly. In an instant, the blue-haired girl grabbed Hakama and pressed a knife against her neck while shouting at Jin not to move, warning that she would kill her if he did. Hakama looked toward them in panic, while Jin calmly realized that they had walked straight into a trap. As the blue-haired girl's expression grew even fiercer, Jin quickly understood that the real enemies were nearby. That meant someone truly capable of hiding themselves was present. At that moment, an invisible figure suddenly revealed himself. A brown-haired mutant man appeared alongside two other mutant companions, clearly the leader of the group. The leader praised the blue-haired girl, Powell, for carrying out his instructions perfectly. Looking at him, Jin immediately recognized the ability being used. It was stealth camouflage, a nanomachine function that copied the surrounding visuals to create invisibility. The weakness was that the camouflage normally broke once the user moved, but the man had handled it skillfully. The leader then pointed his sword toward Jin and mocked his expensive-looking clothes, asking what country a lesser species like him came from. He pressed the blade closer and warned Jin not to move. Seeing this, Hakama anxiously called out Jin's name. The leader turned toward her and reminded her that she already knew what would happen if she moved carelessly. Angered, Hakama began gathering energy around her fist, preparing to attack. Before she could act, Jin loudly called out her name, stopping her instantly. He calmly reminded her that her holy power was not meant to be used against people, and that she already understood that. Still unwilling to back down, Hakama tried to protest, but the leader interrupted with surprise after realizing that she possessed holy power as well. At that moment, the group's bulky and muscular mutant member stepped toward Jin and asked whether he could use holy power too. Jin simply replied that who knew. Annoyed by the answer, the bulky mutant suddenly kicked Jin hard in the stomach, knocking him to the ground. Hakama immediately panicked and shouted Jin's name. The bulky mutant prepared to kick him again, while warning him not to get cocky just because he was a lesser species. However, the leader stopped him, telling him not to damage the merchandise. The bulky mutant complained that lesser species were not worth much money anyway. Another member reminded him that Jin might possess holy power. Even then, the bulky mutant refused to believe that a lesser species could have such an ability. At that moment, Hakama realized that these men were the infamous slave traders known throughout the region. The leader then activated his electrical abilities and ordered the pair to fall asleep. Terrified, Hakama realized that they were about to be sold as slaves themselves. Later, inside a dark underground hideout, Jin gently tried to wake Hakama. Startled, the girl regained consciousness and discovered that both of them had been locked inside a cage. Relieved to see Jin unharmed beside her, she quickly asked whether he was all right. Jin calmly confirmed that he was fine before observing their surroundings and concluding that they had been taken to the bandits' base. As he looked around, he noticed that many other prisoners had also been captured there. Some sat silently, with hopeless expressions, while others were visibly injured. In another nearby cage, a young elf-like girl stared at the floor in fear and despair. Inside their own cell, Jin and Hakama quietly observed the miserable atmosphere around them. Hakama then noticed that Jin was barely clothed again and asked what had happened to his outfit. Jin explained that the bandits confiscated his clothes because they considered them valuable. Surprisingly calm, he casually remarked that he had already spent most of his life nearly without clothing anyway. Still confused, Hakama asked why he had not fought back earlier. According to her, Jin easily possessed enough strength to defeat every bandit there. Jin simply stared ahead, silently, instead of answering. Sometime later, one of the bandits ordered the blue-haired girl to deliver food to the prisoners. Meanwhile, Jin sat peacefully inside the cage with his eyes closed in meditation while Hakama quietly watched him. When the blue-haired girl arrived carrying a tray, she was shocked to see that both of them were already awake. Hakama immediately exploded in anger and shouted at the girl for betraying them. Lowering her head sadly, the blue-haired woman replied that Hakama had every right to hate her and admitted she never expected forgiveness. Gripping the bars tightly, Hakama glared at her with pure fury. However, Jin suddenly interrupted the argument and calmly stated that the woman was actually a kind person. Both girls stared at him in confusion. Jin explained that truly evil people never cared whether others hated them or whether they deserved forgiveness. Then, without effort, he stood up and bent apart the thick metal bars of the cage with his bare hands. The blue-haired girl stared in complete disbelief at the absurd display of strength. Jin calmly stepped out of the cell, as if nothing unusual had happened. The girl remained frozen in shock while he explained that he intentionally waited for her arrival, so they could speak privately. He then asked where the person important to her was being held hostage. The girl was stunned that he had figured it out so quickly. Jin admitted it was only a guess at first. He explained that her injuries were genuine, which initially fooled him. However, he realized that even criminals would not normally injure one of their own that severely unless they were forcing her to cooperate. From that, he concluded that the bandits must have been threatening someone precious to her. Hearing this, the blue-haired girl suddenly bent over in pain from the emotional pressure. Jin quietly asked whether it was her younger brother. Tears filled her eyes as she confirmed it. She remembered the day the bandits kidnapped her brother and threatened to sell him away forever if she refused to obey them. Crying openly now, she explained that she had already lost her parents long ago, and her little brother was the only family she had left. Hakama silently watched the scene unfold, unsure of what to say. Jin's expression darkened with anger as he called the slave traitors the worst kind of scum. Hakama then realized the truth and asked whether he had intentionally allowed himself to be captured in order to help the girl. Jin calmly confirmed that he had. He then explained that criminals like those men were stubborn and difficult to remove completely, though Hakama looked confused by the strange comparison. Jin explained that letting even one criminal escape would only create more victims somewhere else in the future. To him, if someone intended to stop evil, they had to eliminate it completely. Without hesitation, he punched the prison door and sent it flying across the room. The heavy metal gate slammed directly into one of the guards and knocked him unconscious instantly. As Jin stepped out of the cell, surrounded by a cold, dark aura, he calmly declared that he intended to wipe out every bandit in the hideout. At that moment, memories from 100 million years ago resurfaced in his mind. The scene shifted to a futuristic city filled with neon lights and flying vehicles. A younger Jin appeared there with black hair, blue eyes, and bruises covering his face. Back then, he often watched broadcasts about heroes fighting for justice and dreamed of becoming someone like them. However, the reality of that advanced world was far harsher than he imagined. As he wandered alone through the crowded streets, Jin slowly realized that a society constantly talking about justice was also a society overflowing with corruption and violence. All he had wanted was an ordinary life, but the world around him never allowed him peace. Surrounded by criminals and brutality from a young age, Jin eventually decided to fight back with everything he had. To survive, He concluded that he could not afford mercy against people who would never stop hurting others. Over time, fighting became his entire life. As he grew older, he continued defeating every criminal who crossed his path until the day a mysterious scientist finally approached him. That man was Kagura. The researcher told Jin that he had been born into the wrong era and extended his hand toward him, offering him a new purpose. Back in the present, Jin dragged one of the unconscious bandits across the floor effortlessly while the remaining guards panicked and ordered him to stop. Within moments, however, every guard in the corridor had already been defeated. One wounded bandit leaned against the wall and desperately asked where someone like Jin had even come from. Jin answered only with a cold smile. Without slowing down, he threw another bandit directly into one of his companions. Even the man who caught the body was stunned by the overwhelming force behind the throw. Jin then attacked the next target before the man could react. Frozen with fear, the remaining bandits realized they stood no chance against him. One of the last conscious guards nervously demanded to know who Jin really was, but Jin simply stared at him silently. Terrified, the man tried fighting back anyway, only to be crushed by Jin's overwhelming strength. Elsewhere inside the hideout, terrified screams echoed through the prison area and startled the captives. The blue-haired girl immediately recognized the voices and turned pale. Frightened, she asked Hakama who Jin truly was. With complete confidence, Hakama proudly declared that he was the guardian god. She then reassured the prisoners and told them to leave everything to Jin while leading the captives out of their cells. Some of the prisoners hesitated, wondering whether they could really be saved, while the blue-haired girl worried because she knew the bandit leader possessed powerful abilities. Meanwhile, the gang's leader had already lost all confidence. Terrified, he begged Jin to spare him and quickly try negotiating. With a desperate smile, he offered money, valuables, and even the slaves as a peace offering, telling Jin he could take whichever prisoner he wanted. Jin looked at him with visible disgust and gave no response. After a brief silence, Jin calmly asked whether he had finished talking. The bandit leader froze in confusion before suddenly realizing that his spiritual magic had completely stopped functioning. Panic spread across his face as he desperately tried to understand how his powers had been nullified so easily. Jin coldly explained that the man was nothing more than a mediocre villain. According to him, truly dangerous criminals would have fled immediately after witnessing overwhelming power. Instead, people like the bandit leader always believed they could still win. Then, once defeat became certain, they begged desperately for their lives. Realizing he was cornered, the bandit leader suddenly ran toward a hidden lever on the wall while shouting that the battle was not over yet. With a twisted grin, he activated the mechanism and opened a secret chamber nearby. From inside the dark room, a giant purple monster slowly emerged. The creature smashed apart its cage with a powerful kick and roared furiously as it stepped into the corridor. The bandit leader proudly introduced it as a special invader and confidently declared that the monster would kill Jin within seconds. The giant beast immediately charged forward and threw a devastating punch straight toward Jin. The bandit leader smiled victoriously, convinced the fight was over. But Jin calmly raised one hand and caught the monster's massive fist effortlessly, stopping the attack completely in place. The bandit leader could only stare in disbelief after seeing Jin stop the monster's attack with one hand. Calmly, Jin explained that he had been born with a superhuman body. His muscles contained far more fibers than those of an ordinary human, which was why his physical strength was overwhelming even without relying entirely on divine power. Before the monster could react again, Jin drove a precise punch directly into its face and sent the giant creature flying backward. He then warned the beast that he had no intention of holding back anymore. Blue energy erupted around his body as he released his power. In the next instant, Jin fired an enormous beam of light that completely engulfed the creature. The bandit leader watched in terror as the monster was vaporized instantly. Unable to understand what he had witnessed, the criminal questioned how Jin managed to unleash such power without using divine magic like everyone else. Jin silently listened while the terrified man nervously asked what he intended to do next. Cold sweat poured down the bandit leader's face as he desperately begged for mercy. However, he He quickly realized that Jin had no intention of allowing him to escape alive. Before the man could continue talking, Jin kicked him directly in the face and knocked him unconscious. With the fight finally over, Jin calmly retrieved his stolen clothes and put on his long coat once again. After adjusting the collar, he seemed satisfied to have recovered his belongings. He then turned toward the imprisoned children and told them to wait a little longer. Promising to free everyone soon, he explained that he first needed to take care of a few remaining details. Jin walked over to a nearby desk and began searching through the drawers for evidence connected to the gang's crimes. Inside one of the wooden compartments, he discovered a strange document. The moment he picked it up, he sensed that it contained something suspicious. Unfortunately, the language written across the pages was completely unfamiliar to him. The symbols and letters looked bizarre, making it impossible for him to understand even a single sentence. Even so, Jin pretended to remain composed and smirked as though he fully understood the contents. Internally, however, he admitted that he would probably need Hakama to teach him how to read the modern language later. Soon after, he noticed several dark stones placed around the room and began questioning why the bandits had captured the giant monster in the first place. Curious about the truth, Jin activated the nanomachines within his body and connected to the microscopic surveillance units scattered throughout the hideout. Floating screens appeared before him as he searched through recordings from the previous week. To his surprise, the footage revealed that the bandits had intentionally transported the monster there themselves. One recording showed the bandit leader arguing that keeping such a dangerous creature was pointless. However, a mysterious man responded that something important would soon happen within the kingdom. Watching the footage carefully, Jin realized the entire attack on Hakama's village had been planned from the beginning. It was not a random incident at all. Someone had deliberately captured and released the monster as part of a much larger scheme. Outside the hideout, the rescued prisoners gathered together and cautiously wondered whether they were finally safe. The blue-haired girl suddenly heard footsteps approaching and noticed the rescued captives becoming nervous. Moments later, a small blue-haired boy ran toward her and tightly hugged her. Overcome with relief, the siblings embraced each other while tears filled the girl's eyes. She cried openly after finally managing to protect the only family she had left. After calming down, she sincerely thanked Jin and called him the savior of her life. Jin smiled faintly and reminded her once again that he was not a god. Suddenly, he noticed several men restraining the defeated bandits nearby and asked who they were. The blue-haired girl explained that they belonged to the guild and proudly revealed that she had secretly contacted them for help. Jin was impressed by her quick thinking. She then pointed toward a large horned man nearby and explained that he was the guild master. The old man approached Jin respectfully and introduced himself as Padrak. Bowing politely, he thanked Jin for helping eliminate the criminal organization. After observing Jin more carefully, Padrak concluded that he was clearly no ordinary traveler. The guild master explained that the organization had received numerous requests to destroy the bandits, but had struggled to fully eliminate them until now. Jin was surprised to hear that the local king had apparently done nothing to stop the slave traders. Padrak laughed at the misunderstanding and clarified that regional rulers possessed very limited authority. According to him, the guild itself was responsible for maintaining order because it served the great king of the entire nation directly. He proudly stated that if a local ruler committed crimes or abused power, the guild had the authority to arrest them personally. In essence, the guild acted as a form of national police force. Hearing this, Jin quietly remembered the suspicious recordings involving the monster and the mention of the kingdom. The more he thought about it, the less trustworthy the king seemed. Even so, Jin simply apologized and told Padrak to forget his earlier questions. For the moment, he decided to keep the conspiracy he uncovered entirely to himself. Jin looked at the rescued prisoners gathered outside the hideout and asked Padrak what would happen to them now. The guild master explained that anyone whose family or hometown could be identified would eventually be returned home. However, for people who had nowhere left to go, the guild had no system capable of supporting them. Hearing this, the blue-haired girl lowered her head sadly, knowing that she and her younger brother had nowhere to return to. Jin frowned at the situation and asked whether the kingdom truly had no shelters or protection for abandoned people. Padrak shook his head and admitted that no such facilities existed anywhere in the country. Looking at the frightened little boy beside his sister, Jin quietly said that he wanted to help them somehow. After thinking for a moment, he suddenly remembered the invitation Argus had given him earlier. With a confident smile, Jin asked the siblings whether they would be willing to work in a safe place where they could live peacefully. He hinted that he already had the perfect location in mind for them. Far away in the royal capital, the luxurious mansion of the Holy Knights stood proudly within the enormous city. At that moment, Argus finally returned from his long patrol alongside his division. After dismounting from his horse, he praised his soldiers for their hard work and ordered everyone to rest. Suddenly, however, he felt an uneasy chill. His green-haired companion noticed the change immediately and asked whether something was wrong, but Argus dismissed it casually and continued inside the mansion. As he entered the grand hall, several maids with animal-like features respectfully bowed to welcome him home. Walking through the luxurious residence, Argus asked the head butler whether anything important had happened during his absence. The butler immediately became nervous, sweating heavily as he struggled to answer. Sensing the tension, Argus stopped and demanded to know what had happened. The butler apologized for disturbing him after such a long mission before leaning closer and whispering the details quietly into his ear. Meanwhile, from the staircase above, an elegant blonde woman silently watched the conversation with crossed arms and a serious expression. After hearing the report, Argus thanked the butler, though his expression quickly darkened. He learned that monsters had somehow appeared inside the royal capital itself. Immediately, he concluded that the creatures must have been intentionally brought into the city by someone. Since Herisk Academy had extremely restricted access, Argus suspected the academy might somehow be connected to the incident. Realizing the situation could become dangerous, he decided that he would need strong allies moving forward. 3 days after the battle with the bandits, Jin's group finally approached the royal capital. Along the road, the blue-haired girl nervously asked whether she would truly be able to find work there. Jin reassured her calmly, explaining that anyone who could read, write, and handle mathematics would always be useful somewhere. Encouraged by his words, the girl regained confidence and thanked him sincerely. Soon after, Hakama excitedly pointed toward the horizon and announced that they had finally arrived. Jin looked up and was immediately surprised by the sight before him. Ahead stood an enormous walled city, far larger than anything he expected. Once inside the capital, Jin noticed how lively and crowded the streets were. Medieval-style buildings filled the city while merchants, travelers, and citizens from many different races moved through the busy roads. Hakama explained that the capital prospered through trade and imports, which was why products from all over the kingdom eventually gathered there. Even people from her own village regularly came to sell their fabrics in the city. As Jin observed the crowds more carefully, he noticed races with insect wings and other unique evolutionary traits. The blue-haired girl commented that the city had become a meeting place for countless races and cultures over time. The shops displayed goods from many regions, the streets were surprisingly clean, and children played freely without fear. Jin quickly realized that law and order were maintained extremely well within the capital. Even so, his expression slowly became more serious. Behind the peaceful atmosphere, he could still sense the darker reality of discrimination and forced servitude that existed within society. Quietly, Jin reflected that every era carried its own problems, no matter how peaceful it appeared on the surface. He then asked Hakama when the entrance examination for Herisk Academy would begin. The little girl answered that it would take place the following week. Relieved to hear they still had time, Jin continued walking through the city. Nearby, a young blonde noblewoman noticed the group and looked at them with visible disdain, quietly mocking the mixed-blood children in her thoughts. Later that evening, the group finally rented rooms at a comfortable inn to recover from the long journey. The children immediately jumped onto the beds excitedly and celebrated finally being able to rest properly. Sitting down himself, Jin admitted that he had missed sleeping in a real bed. Hakama happily agreed with him. As the others relaxed, Jin quietly looked at the small bag of coins in his hand and reflected on their future. No matter how much the world had changed over millions of years, one thing clearly remained the same. Living in society still required money. Hakama held the reward money they had received, but Jin warned her that the amount would not last forever. On top of that, he still needed to find work and a safe place for the blue-haired siblings rescued from the bandits. Jin considered searching for Argus since the knight had previously offered help, but he had no way to contact him directly. Resting his hand against his chin, Jin began thinking through all the problems ahead. At the same time, he wondered whether he should first focus on investigating the corruptors of this era. As memories of the conspiracy involving the monsters resurfaced, he realized that dangerous people were already exploiting those creatures for their own plans. Looking out over the city through the inn's window, Jin quietly decided that he could not ignore that threat any longer. With a determined expression, he vowed that he would never allow history to repeat itself again. Wanting information, Jin asked how people in this era usually conducted research. Hakama explained that most learning came either from teachers or books. Unfortunately, books were extremely expensive. In her village, people often pooled their money together just to buy a single one. However, she also mentioned that the royal capital possessed a large library where people could research many subjects. The idea immediately caught Jin's attention. He repeated the word library to himself and realized that such a place might contain clues connected to Kagura's old laboratories or the hidden facilities scattered around the world. Later, the group visited the capital's library. A pink-haired librarian politely smiled before apologetically informing them that their request could not be granted. The books stored there were considered national treasures, so access was restricted to nobles, teachers, and students connected to the academy. At that moment, Hakama casually pointed out that Jin could not even read properly yet. Jin openly admitted that he was still illiterate in the modern language. Although he had started learning the alphabet, he knew it would take a long time before he could comfortably read full texts. Pressing a hand against his face, Jin quietly wondered how he was supposed to solve that problem. At that moment, two hooded figures nearby began observing the group closely. One of them quietly confirmed that Jin was their target. Sensing hostile intent immediately, Jin turned toward them and calmly asked what they wanted. Without warning, one of the attackers, a young man with wolf ears, charged at Jin with a powerful punch. Jin effortlessly blocked the attack with one hand. Looking unimpressed, he sarcastically commented on the capital's idea of hospitality and security. The wolf-eared attacker smirked and replied that Jin clearly misunderstood how the city really worked. Yellow energy suddenly surged around the young man's hand as he activated divine power. The two briefly clashed, causing a burst of energy that exploded across the street and startled nearby civilians. The attacker quickly jumped back while Jin calmly praised his instincts. Hakama and the others were shocked that someone would openly use divine power in broad daylight. Jin then asked directly what the attackers wanted. The wolf-eared youth explained that someone powerful disliked Jin's presence in the city. Hearing this, Jin immediately understood that the attack had been arranged by someone else. Rather than being annoyed, he quietly smirked and realized that the situation might actually help his own plans later. The thug warned Jin to leave the capital immediately, but Jin casually replied that he only worried about genuine threats. Enraged by the response, the wolf-eared fighter attacked again with full force. Jin caught the punch effortlessly in midair, twisted the attacker's arm, and slammed him into the ground in a single motion. Seeing his partner defeated, the second attacker, the red-haired young man, furiously gathered fire magic in his hand and launched a blazing fireball toward Jin. Jin calmly raised his hand and dispersed the flames instantly. Before the attacker could react, Jin appeared directly in front of him with overwhelming speed and grabbed him by the collar. Looking down at the terrified boy, Jin coldly advised him to return only after becoming strong enough to pose a real threat. The young man froze in fear after finally realizing that Jin was nothing like the weak inferior race he had imagined. Suddenly, another voice interrupted the confrontation. A female knight ordered everyone to stay exactly where they were. Clearly annoyed, she complained that people were causing chaos in the middle of the city on her day off. She then declared that everyone involved would be taken into custody. Internally, however, Jin quietly smiled because his plan had worked exactly as intended. Starting a public fight was the easiest way to attract the attention of the Holy Knights. The female knight soon recognized him and angrily pointed out that he was the same so-called inferior from the forest encounter earlier. The two defeated attackers remained sprawled across the ground while the knight glared at Jin with clear hostility. Pointing her weapon toward him, she accused him of causing trouble immediately after arriving in the capital and mocked inferior races for always creating problems. Before the situation escalated further, however, a rabbit-eared woman stepped forward from the crowd and announced that she had witnessed everything. She clearly stated that Jin and his group had been attacked first and that the entire confrontation was self-defense. The knight paused in surprise before finally looking down at the unconscious attackers more carefully. Recognizing them, she realized that the two young men were students from Herisk Academy. Holding her head in frustration, she muttered that she hoped a certain young lady was not involved in this incident as well. Curious, Jin asked who she meant, but the knight dismissed the question and told him not to worry about it for now. With a faint smile, Jin casually remarked that even the holy knights apparently spent their days patrolling the streets. The female knight explained that the capital was far too large for the holy knights to ignore public disturbances, so they regularly helped maintain order throughout the city. However, as she spoke, she quietly studied Jin more carefully. After witnessing him overpower Academy students so easily, she realized he was far stronger than he initially appeared. Soon after, she prepared to leave and warned Jin not to cause any more trouble inside the capital. Before she could walk away, however, Jin stopped her and said there was somewhere he wanted to show her. Confused by the sudden request, the knight turned back and asked what he meant. A short while later, the group arrived at the luxurious estate belonging to Argus's family. Seated across from the captain of the Holy Knights, Jin immediately made a direct proposal and asked Argus to hire the blue-haired siblings. Argus looked genuinely surprised and recalled the promise he made earlier about helping Jin if he ever needed assistance. Looking over the larger group now gathered before him, he questioned why Jin's number of companions had increased so much since their first meeting in the forest. Jin calmly explained that he had encountered slave traders and rescued the siblings from captivity. When Argus asked what happened to the criminals, Jin casually answered that he handed them over to the guild. Resting his hand against his chin, Argus then asked whether Jin had defeated the entire bandit organization by himself. Curious, he questioned why Jin bothered helping people who were considered inferior races by society. Jin replied that the siblings had no family and nowhere to go. Since he was the one who saved them, he intended to take responsibility for them until the very end. Argus and the female knight were both surprised by the seriousness of Jin's answer. Hearing those words, the siblings smiled with visible relief and hope. Argus eventually agreed to help them and offered the pair work as servants within the mansion. The blue-haired girl became overwhelmed with gratitude at the opportunity. However, Argus revealed that he had one condition in exchange. He wanted Jin to become an instructor. Jin stared at him in confusion. Soon afterward, the siblings changed into elegant servant uniforms and looked far more refined than before. Jin smiled faintly and commented that the new clothes suited them well. The young woman bowed deeply and thanked Argus for giving them a chance, though he casually replied that it was unnecessary. Argus then instructed the mansion's butler to oversee the siblings' education and specifically warned him not to mistreat them because of their race. As the siblings happily waved goodbye to Jin, he turned back toward Argus and questioned why exactly he was being asked to work as an instructor. Argus praised Jin's instincts before explaining that he trusted him despite knowing almost nothing about his background. He then revealed the true reason behind the invitation. Argus wanted Jin to infiltrate Herisk Academy. Jin immediately questioned why the academy was so important, prompting Argus to explain the unstable political situation within the kingdom. According to him, multiple factions were secretly competing for power because the king had fallen seriously ill. While the succession struggle continued behind the scenes, dangerous individuals with no legitimate claim to the throne were attempting to seize control of the country entirely. To accomplish this, they had begun using monsters and innocent civilians as pawns. As Jin listened, he quickly realized that the conspiracy surrounding the Corruptors was far larger than he originally believed. The group concluded that locating the people responsible needed to become a priority. Jin then directly asked whether Herisk Academy was the most suspicious location connected to the situation. Before Argus could answer, someone knocked on the door. The knight announced that he was bringing someone inside to assist with a mission. Moments later, a blonde-haired young woman entered the room. She was Argus's younger sister and a student at Herisk Academy. According to Argus, she would serve as Jin's guide inside the academy. The girl greeted her brother coldly, while openly staring at Jin with visible disdain. Without hesitation, she questioned whether they truly intended to entrust such an important mission to someone of mixed blood. Annoyed by her attitude, Argus immediately ordered her to show respect, but the girl ignored him completely and continued insulting Jin. She openly declared that she would never accept an inferior race handling something so important. Argus apologized for his sister's childish behavior, but Hakama immediately pointed out that even Argus himself carried prejudice toward inferior races. Ignoring the comment, the blonde noble calmly opened her fan and turned her attention back toward Jin. She explained that aside from infiltrating the academy, he would also need to properly act as an instructor. However, she doubted that someone from his race possessed the intelligence or refinement necessary to teach students. At that exact moment, Hakama accidentally revealed that Jin could not even read properly yet. The room immediately fell silent in shock. Closing her eyes in frustration, the blonde girl declared that the entire situation was absurd. Hakama quickly defended Jin and insisted that he was incredible despite his lack of education. According to her, everyone at the academy could still learn something valuable from him. The noblewoman remained silent for a moment before seriously studying Jin again. Eventually, she admitted that Jin at least possessed enough strength to discipline the academy students. Even so, she warned that becoming an instructor required far more than raw power alone. Meanwhile, Argus buried his face in embarrassment over his sister's attitude. At that point, Jin quietly realized that the academy students who attacked him earlier had most likely been sent by the blonde noblewoman herself. The blue-haired boy quickly apologized for the awkward situation, but Jin calmly assured him that it was fine and there was no need to worry. Jin then asked what exactly he was supposed to teach at the academy. Argus explained that the subject would be spirit magic. According to him, Jin clearly possessed an extraordinary level of control over that power. Curious, Jin asked what kind of techniques students normally learned. Argus casually listed the standard categories taught at Herisk Academy: fire, lightning, ice, and healing magic. He explained that mastering even one of those elements was usually considered impressive. Jin looked slightly confused and asked whether that was all. Argus immediately noticed the strange reaction and wondered whether Jin perhaps used some kind of special magic. Jin did not fully understand what he meant. However, he remembered the bandits and began wondering whether people considered them strong by this era's standards. Finding the entire situation increasingly interesting, Jin decided to completely overturn the academy's understanding of spirit magic. 1 week later, the entrance exam for Herisk Academy began. Students gathered outside the academy grounds to participate in the test, while staff members handed out admission cards before allowing them inside. Among the applicants, Hakama also arrived to take the entrance exam. Meanwhile, inside the academy corridors, Jin walked alongside Argus and another mutant man. As they moved through the hall, the mutant man thanked Argus for coming despite how busy the 7th squad of the Holy Knights must have been. Argus calmly replied that there was no need for thanks, since it was simply their squad's turn. Confused, Jin asked what he meant by that. Argus explained that every year, one Holy Knight squad rotated the duty of sending a member to serve as a special instructor at the academy. This year, that responsibility had fallen to the 7th squad. Jin quietly nodded in understanding, though inwardly he wondered whether he was truly the right choice for the role. Walking ahead of them, the mutant man secretly glanced back toward Jin. After arriving near a room, the mutant man gestured toward the door and invited them inside, explaining that the headmaster was waiting. Inside the office sat the headmaster, an elderly mutant woman with white hair. Standing beside her desk was a man with fox-like ears. Argus respectfully bowed before the headmaster and greeted her, mentioning that it had been a long time since they last met. The headmaster replied that not much time had passed since he graduated from the academy at the top of his class. She commented that he had quickly grown into an impressive man and thanked him for continuing to lend the academy his strength. Argus respectfully answered that it was simply his duty. Leaning back in her chair, the headmaster mentioned hearing many rumors about him. She noted that he was not only busy fighting corruptors, but was also being dragged into the nation's political conflicts. She understood why the Holy Knights lacked manpower to spare, yet she still believed the academy should not be neglected because of it. Her gaze then shifted toward Jin as she questioned whether Argus truly intended to make him an instructor at the academy. The mutant man, the fox-eared man, and the headmaster all turned their attention toward Jin, who simply let out a quiet sigh. Argus then bowed once again and assured them that Jin was more capable than anyone else in his 7th unit, at least when it came to combat techniques. The headmaster admitted that if Argus said so, then it was likely true. However, she still questioned how they were supposed to handle the situation. Immediately, the fox-eared man loudly objected. Pointing angrily at Jin, he declared that it was unprecedented for an inferior species to teach within such a sacred academy of tradition. He insisted that a position like instructor was not meant for someone of Jin's kind and accused them of bringing shame upon the academy. The headmaster then turned toward the mutant man who had escorted Jin and Argus into the office and asked for his opinion after hearing Lord Goeta's objection. Lord Lidman replied that he agreed completely, since the academy was filled with students from noble families. Allowing an inferior species to teach would undoubtedly cause backlash from both the students and the instructors. The headmaster nodded and admitted that emotionally, she felt the same way. However, she still wanted to hear Jin's side before making a decision. Jin stepped forward, bowed respectfully, and apologized for not introducing himself earlier. He stated that he had come from Kodama village and introduced himself as Shidō Jin. After hearing that, the headmaster quietly observed him with interest. Even after being openly mocked, Jin had remained remarkably calm and composed. She acknowledged that his concerns were understandable. Jin then asked a single question. He wanted to know whether he was considered unfit to become an instructor simply because he was an inferior species or because he truly lacked the ability required for the position. The headmaster smiled and answered that ability was what mattered most. If he could prove he possessed the necessary skill, then nothing else would matter. At that moment, Argus suggested that they settle the matter with a direct test. The scene then shifted to the spirit magic practice field of Harnisk Academy. Inside the training ground, Jin and the fox-eared man stood facing each other. The fox-eared man remarked that since it was entrance exam day, very few students were around, so at least Jin would be spared public humiliation. Jin simply looked at him in silence. Standing nearby, the headmaster explained the rules. Since Jin was supposed to become a spirit magic instructor, the two of them would fight using only spirit magic, so his true abilities could be judged properly. Meanwhile, several students nearby noticed the mock battle and began murmuring among themselves. Some wondered what was happening, while others commented that it might be the first time they had ever seen Mr. Goeta fight seriously. Among the spectators stood Argus's blonde-haired younger sister, who inwardly thought the entire situation was pointless. From the balcony overlooking the practice field, the headmaster calmly stated that she wanted to see just how capable an inferior species truly was. Standing beside her, Argus watched Jin carefully. This would be the first time he had personally witnessed Jin fight. Inferior species normally possessed weak physical abilities, and even those with divine power could only draw out a small amount of strength. For the first time, Argus wondered whether his own judgment had been mistaken. Back on the field, the fox-eared man asked Jin whether he was ready. Without waiting long, he declared that he would take the first strike. In the next instant, he created a massive fireball and launched it directly toward Jin. Jin immediately leapt aside and dodged the attack. The watching students became tense as the battle suddenly intensified. Noticing the attention from the crowd, the fox-eared man smirked to himself, pleased that students were watching after all. He raised his hand again and formed multiple arrows infused with both lightning and fire magic before firing them rapidly at Jin. Jumping and flipping through the air, Jin effortlessly avoided every attack. The fox-eared man continued launching wave after wave of magical arrows, but Jin calmly evaded them all. Watching Jin dodge repeatedly, the fox-eared man inwardly scoffed that all Jin could do was run away like a typical inferior species. Although he had failed to become a holy knight, he had once graduated from the academy as valedictorian. In his mind, there was no way an inferior species could ever rival him. Determined to finish things, he gathered an even greater amount of fire energy into a gigantic fireball and hurled it toward Jin. Jin effortlessly avoided the attack once again. As he moved, he quietly thought to himself that this power was never meant to be used against people. However, under the circumstances, it could not be helped. In the next moment, Jin activated his power and gathered lightning energy into his palm. With a serious expression, he stated that he would only show them a little. The instant he released the energy, a glowing shield formed around the fox-eared man. Before the man could react, the shield suddenly compressed with overwhelming force, slamming him into the ground hard enough to shatter the stone beneath him. The headmaster and Lord Lidman were left stunned by the sudden display of power. Even Argus became visibly shocked after witnessing Jin's overwhelming control and strength. Among the spectators, Argus's sister stared at the fox-eared man pinned helplessly to the ground in disbelief, unable to understand what had just happened. Jin calmly walked toward the defeated man and casually asked whether he had merely adjusted the gravity around him slightly. He remarked that he had never seen a spirit art like that before. With a faint smile, Jin added that it seemed the academy still had much to learn. As he adjusted his gloves, he calmly continued, saying that it was not only the students who still had things to learn, but the instructors as well. Standing over the fox-eared man as he struggled on the shattered ground, Jin flicked his finger and deactivated the technique, causing the shield to disappear instantly. The fox-eared man slowly rose to his feet and angrily demanded to know what Jin had just done. Jin calmly answered with only 2 words: "Spirit arts." The fox-eared man immediately shouted in frustration, claiming he had never heard of spirit arts like that before and accusing Jin of using some kind of cheap trick. Trying to calm the situation, Jin casually told him to relax. Watching from the balcony, the headmaster quietly stated that the result had already settled the matter. Argus smiled and agreed. Meanwhile, the students watching the battle were left stunned by Jin's power. One of them hurriedly approached Argus's sister and excitedly asked whether she had seen what just happened. However, Argus's sister remained deep in thought. She realized that what Jin had used was clearly a special spirit art, yet it made no sense to her. Unlike their species, which had evolved under the blessing of the spirits, inferior species were supposed to possess almost no holy power at all. As she continued staring at Jin, only one question remained in her mind. What exactly was that man? 1 week later, Harris Academy officially welcomed its newest students. The institution taught a wide range of subjects, but its true purpose was training warriors capable of fighting the invaders threatening the kingdom. Students unable to endure the harsh standards would be expelled without hesitation. During the opening ceremony, the headmistress reminded everyone that successful graduates could even rise high enough to become holy knights someday. According to her, a person's future depended entirely on their own ability. Meanwhile, inside the noble seating area, several students observed the incoming freshmen. One young noble commented that many commoners had enrolled this year. Soon afterward, a red-haired lion-eared student named Reyes approached the blonde noblewoman and greeted her. He seemed surprised that she attended the ceremony at all, since she normally showed little interest in other students. Smiling slightly, the young woman explained that she was there because someone interesting had appeared among the instructors. Reyes soon noticed Jin standing below with the faculty members and immediately became confused after realizing that a mixed-blood outsider was apparently teaching at the academy. The noblewoman asked what he thought about the new instructor. Reyes found himself unable to answer. The blonde girl admitted that she initially dismissed Jin as just another insignificant mixed blood, but his power clearly made him different. Meanwhile, Jin quietly observed the enormous academy grounds and realized that investigating everything there would take considerable time. At the same time, he could feel the hostile stares directed toward him from the noble students above. Understanding the situation immediately, Jin concluded that he first needed to change the academy's opinion of him. If he wanted to investigate without suspicion, he would need to earn the students' respect. Soon afterward, the scene shifted to one of Harris Academy's classrooms. A teacher announced that spirit magic lessons would soon begin again and warned the elite class not to underestimate the academy's newest instructor. With a sly smile, the instructor clearly seemed interested in seeing Jin fail. Inside the classroom, many seats remained empty. The teacher sarcastically wondered whether the students had already lost motivation. Sitting with crossed arms, the blonde noblewoman admitted that most students simply had no interest in being taught by a mixed blood. The large-nosed professor openly mocked the situation and proudly revealed that he personally spread rumors about the new instructor's race throughout the academy. Soon after, the wolf-eared instructor called Jin into the classroom to introduce himself properly. With a calm smile, Jin introduced himself as Shidō Jin and explained that he would be teaching spirit magic classes for some time. He also expressed his hope that everyone could work together peacefully. Reyes immediately questioned whether Jin was truly qualified to teach them. Jin calmly answered that the decision ultimately depended on the students themselves. If they believed the lessons were worthless, they were free not to participate. The red-haired student smirked at the response, but Jin suddenly added that there was one rule every student would follow without exception. As he spoke, he manifested spirit magic in front of the class. Jin explained that spirit magic existed for one purpose: stopping the regeneration abilities of the invaders threatening humanity. Against humans, however, the power merely caused ordinary injuries. With a serious expression, Jin warned the students that spirit magic was never meant to be abused against other people. Hearing those words, the blonde noblewoman quietly fell into thought. One of the students suddenly mocked Jin, claiming that power was simply power and that his lectures sounded foolish. A cat-eared student added that he only came to watch a mixed blood embarrass himself, while another student dismissed Jin as weak and beneath comparison with the rest of the class. Soon, the entire classroom began laughing and openly ridiculing the academy's new instructor. Jin, however, remained completely calm and expressionless. After silently observing the students for a moment, he challenged them directly. If they truly believed he lacked power, they were free to test him themselves. The cat-eared student looked confused, but Jin calmly told him to use his strongest attack. With a faint smile, Jin added that if he were seriously injured, he would never return to teach the class again. Completely confident in his own strength, the gray-haired student immediately accepted the challenge. Energy surged around his body as he warned Jin not to regret provoking him. The large-nosed professor instantly panicked and shouted for the student to stop before someone got hurt. Ignoring the warning, the student unleashed a massive beam of yellow energy directly at Jin. The attack exploded across the classroom floor, filling the room with smoke and dust. Believing he had won, the gray-haired student proudly boasted about his strength. But in the next instant, a sharp shard of ice shot past his head at terrifying speed. The attack barely grazed him before embedding itself deeply into the wall behind him. Frozen with fear, the student slowly realized how close he had come to death. Surrounded by a faint blue aura, Jin calmly explained that if he had truly intended to attack, the student would already be dead. Looking directly at the class, he warned them that judging people solely by appearance could easily become a fatal mistake. The red-haired student stared in shock, while others nervously wondered whether the attack had really been spirit magic. Jin then reminded them that they constantly called him inferior because of his race. Since he was clearly stronger than all of them, he asked what they should properly call him instead. With a confident smile, he answered the question himself. The correct title was Professor. The room instantly fell silent. Jin then questioned the gray-haired student about the true conditions required to activate spirit magic. The student nervously explained that magic depended on visualization and projecting one's will into the spirits. Jin acknowledged that visualization was important, but clarified that it was not the true activation condition. According to him, the so-called spirits were actually nanomachines responding to specific wavelengths. The students immediately became confused by the unfamiliar explanation. Jin continued by revealing that spirit magic was divided into 8 fundamental wave types. As he spoke, various forms of energy appeared around him to demonstrate each category. First came fire magic, followed by lightning, wind, and ice. The students recognized those 4 immediately since they were commonly taught at the academy. However, Jin then revealed entirely different powers that none of them had ever heard of. A sphere of purple energy appeared as he demonstrated gravity manipulation. Next, he showed the manipulation of light itself through a brilliant white glow. He then altered atmospheric pressure around the room before finally displaying the spatial protection barrier he used earlier during the attack. The large-nosed professor stared in complete disbelief and shouted that Jin was somehow using all 8 types of spirit magic. Jin calmly explained that visualization only served as the method for applying the basic principles behind the wavelengths. With that, he casually returned to the front of the classroom and asked whether they could finally begin the real lesson. Later that day, Jin wandered through the long corridors of Herisk Academy while continuing his investigation. However, he quickly encountered a major problem. Students filled nearly every hallway and courtyard, making it difficult to search for anything suspicious unnoticed. Realizing this, Jin decided he needed to find restricted areas where ordinary students were forbidden from entering. At that moment, he suddenly locked eyes with a blonde noblewoman from earlier. The two stared at each other seriously from opposite sides of the corridor before she finally approached him directly. Without hesitation, she asked who he truly was. Jin calmly admitted that he was far from ordinary. The young woman replied that no mixed blood should be capable of using all forms of spirit magic. Jin simply explained that anyone could theoretically do the same thing if they learned how to alter the wavelength of their power correctly. The blonde noble immediately rejected that explanation, pointing out that if it were truly that simple, the entire academy would already be using those techniques. Seeing her persistence, Jin suggested they continue the conversation somewhere more private. The two eventually moved to a quiet courtyard far from the crowds. Once alone, the blonde student looked at him seriously and demanded honest answers. Jin then calmly revealed the truth. He explained that he was an ancient human who had slept for 100 million years before awakening near Hakima's village. Naturally, the girl found the story impossible to believe. She questioned what someone like him could possibly have done in such a distant era. Resting his hand against his chin, Jin casually answered that he had done many things in his old life, but most importantly, he had worked as a special agent. The girl did not understand the term, so Jin explained that it referred to someone who fought on behalf of their country. With a faint smile, he recalled battling countless dangerous criminals and enemies in his former world. As he spoke, memories surfaced of him relaxing beside his teammates inside a futuristic war room long before the fall of civilization. Jin quietly remembered his former teammates explaining battle strategies inside futuristic war rooms before dangerous missions. Images of old battlefields flashed through his mind as he recalled running through explosions during humanity's final wars. A faint nostalgic smile appeared on his face. The blonde noblewoman then asked how he had managed to survive for so long. Jin calmly replied that, in the end, he had failed. He admitted that he had been arrogant in the past and believed he could solve every problem alone. Because of that mindset, humanity lost everything, and he was unable to stop the monsters before civilization collapsed. According to him, the reason he became an instructor now was because he would eventually need the help of others in the future. The young woman then asked where exactly they were going. Jin replied that she was simply carrying out her role as his guide. Eventually, the pair arrived at an old storage room hidden within the academy grounds. Dust covered most of the furniture and shelves stacked with books and teaching materials. The noblewoman explained that the room was mainly used to store and used instructor equipment. Looking around carefully, Jin noticed several old books and a small statue sitting quietly on one shelf. At that moment, the girl unfolded a document and revealed that she had conducted her own investigation beforehand. She pointed toward an unusual empty space marked on the academy's floor plan directly beside the storage room. Immediately understanding what she meant, Jin approached the small statue and activated the hidden mechanism. The nearby bookshelf slowly slid aside and revealed a secret staircase descending underground. Jin praised the girl's deduction skills and admitted that she had been completely correct. Curious, she asked how he discovered the hidden entrance so quickly despite the room being covered in dust. Jin pointed toward the floor near the statue and explained that one specific area had been unnaturally clean. Combined with instinct, that inconsistency was enough for him to suspect a hidden passage. Although he warned her that he intended to continue the investigation alone, the noblewoman firmly insisted on accompanying him. Jin reminded her that the place could be dangerous, but she ignored the warning entirely. Confidently, she claimed that her abilities and academic performance were just as impressive as her brother's. With an amused smirk, Jin eventually agreed and accepted her help. The two then descended the staircase together, while Jin created a floating sphere of light to illuminate the darkness around them. Observing the spell carefully, the noblewoman commented that light manipulation seemed like an incredibly useful ability. Jin casually replied that the underground passage resembled something from a fantasy game, though the girl did not understand the strange term. As they continued walking, she returned to their earlier conversation and asked whether he already had a suspect regarding the conspiracy inside the academy. Jin smiled slightly at her enthusiasm before admitting that he did have someone in mind. According to him, Professor Lidman seemed suspicious. The noblewoman immediately questioned why he suspected the professor. Jin explained that although the man acted calm outwardly, his attention constantly drifted elsewhere. To him, that behavior resembled someone being forced to carry out tasks against their will. The girl admitted that she personally suspected Professor Gilda instead, but Jin immediately dismissed the idea. He explained that Gilda's emotions were far too easy to read and that she seemed fundamentally kind-hearted. With that, the pair continued descending deeper underground. Eventually, they reached the end of the corridor, where Jin's light illuminated a massive hidden chamber ahead. The noblewoman was stunned by the sheer size of the underground structure and admitted she never imagined such a place existed beneath the academy. Suddenly, Jin stopped walking. When the girl asked what he found, he stared ahead in visible surprise and admitted that even he had not expected to discover something like this there. Ahead of them stood a gigantic metallic door resembling the entrance to an advanced laboratory. Jin immediately recognized it as one of Kagura's hidden facilities. He explained that the entrance was protected by nanomachines and stated that he had no doubt the laboratory belonged to his old companion. The girl stared at the enormous door in shock before asking whether it could actually be opened. Jin replied that they would need an access key. Since she did not understand the term, he compared it to a normal key used for unlocking doors. As he thought more carefully, Jin remembered the pendant Hakama possessed back in the village and concluded that someone within the academy likely held another access key connected to this facility. After a moment of thought, Jin gathered energy into his hand and pressed it against the metal door. Blue light immediately spread across the surface as the system recognized his access authority. With a heavy mechanical sound, the massive door slowly began opening. Watching the process carefully, Jin quietly concluded that whoever was orchestrating the incidents at the academy almost certainly possessed a key connected to the laboratory. Once inside, the pair discovered countless cages filled with monsters. At the center of the chamber stood an especially massive creature locked inside a reinforced enclosure. The blonde noblewoman was completely speechless after seeing the horrifying scene. Still trying to understand everything happening around her, she questioned how Jin managed to open the laboratory without a key. Jin simply replied that being an ancient human came with certain advantages. Hearing that answer again, the girl quietly repeated the words ancient human to herself while trying to process the impossible truth. Resting her hand against her chin, she finally asked whether he truly came from 100 million years in the past. Jin ignored the question for the moment and approached one of the cages instead. Staring closely at a green monster inside, he quickly realized something strange. None of the creatures were attempting to escape. Even though the cages were clearly holding dangerous monsters, every single one remained unusually calm and passive. Jin immediately remembered the monsters kept by the bandits behaving the exact same way. More importantly, he could not understand how creatures this large were secretly transported beneath the academy without anyone noticing. The noblewoman quietly admitted that her brother had been correct all along. Harrisk Academy was definitely hiding something dangerous. She then suggested setting a trap to expose the culprit. Jin immediately rejected the idea. According to him, their top priority was sealing the laboratory and eliminating the monsters before anything worse happened. The girl was shocked by his decision and questioned whether they were really going to let the criminal escape without capturing them first. Jin explained that if the monsters escaped from the laboratory, the academy students would become the first victims. The blonde noblewoman immediately remembered that her brother always placed people's safety above everything else. After hearing Jin's reasoning, she agreed with the plan. Jin then admitted that he had a very bad feeling about the underground facility. According to him, his instincts rarely failed, and something about the laboratory felt deeply wrong. He asked the girl to contact Argus immediately and have the entire academy sealed off before the situation grew worse. The young noblewoman nodded and hurried away to call for reinforcements from her brother. Now alone, Jin carefully observed the laboratory once more. His attention soon focused on a large blue clock mounted high on the wall. The object seemed strangely important compared to everything else in the room. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the academy, several professors casually chatted in the corridors. Two instructors mocked the large-nosed professor about the humiliation he suffered during Jin's class demonstration. Furious, the professor complained that his reputation had been completely destroyed because of the new instructor. He loudly accused Jin of cheating and insisted that no one should be capable of using 8 types of spirit magic. Filled with resentment, he swore that he would eventually expose the outsider's secrets. Suddenly, someone called his name. The academy headmistress approached and immediately scolded him for causing a scene in public. Embarrassed, the professor insisted that his behavior was not some strange hobby. Ignoring the argument, the headmistress calmly asked whether he had seen Professor Lidman recently. The man suddenly became uneasy and admitted that he had not seen Lidman since the academy entrance ceremony. The headmistress sighed with disappointment because she wanted to discuss the new student's curriculum with him. However, before the conversation could continue, she suddenly sensed something strange in the air. Her expression immediately turned serious. Looking out the window, she saw dark purple energy slowly spreading across the sky above the academy. At the same time, the blonde noblewoman rushed desperately through the hidden passageways while trying to reach her brother. After climbing the final staircase, she finally emerged from the secret route and stopped briefly to catch her breath. Just as she prepared to continue, a voice suddenly asked what exactly she intended to tell him. Frozen in shock, the girl turned around. Standing directly in front of her was Professor Lidman. The moment she saw the malicious smile on his face, she understood the truth immediately. Back inside the laboratory, another hidden door suddenly opened and flooded the dark corridor with red light. Jin turned toward the source and questioned what kind of object had appeared within the chamber. Inside the newly revealed room stood a gigantic pulsating brain connected to countless machines and cables. The massive organ glowed ominously with red light while beating like a living creature. Jin approached the control panel nearby and quietly wondered whether Kagura had really created something like this. As he examined the machinery, he accidentally triggered a hidden compartment within the desk. Inside, he discovered another injection capsule alongside a mysterious cube left behind by Kagura. Hoping to uncover answers, Jin activated the cube. A hologram immediately appeared, projecting Kagura's image before him. The scientist calmly explained that this laboratory was the closest facility to the place where Jin originally awakened. With a serious expression, Kagura revealed that the facility had been created to develop an extraordinary device. Part of its functionality, he explained, had already been integrated into the nanomachines themselves. Striking a proud pose, Kagura smugly asked whether Jin could guess the purpose of the machine. Moments later, he revealed the answer. The laboratory contained a teleportation device. Jin was genuinely shocked by the revelation. He stared at the giant machine while trying to process the idea that teleportation technology had actually been completed. Nearby, an enormous monster remained imprisoned behind reinforced barriers, while the glowing red core continued pulsing at the center of the laboratory. In the distance, the Holy Knights watched the battle in complete disbelief as Jin overwhelmed the colossal monster with impossible speed and power. The girls observing from a terrace were equally speechless. Without slowing down, Jin charged forward once more and unleashed a storm of high-speed slashes across the giant creature's body. Blue energy blades carved through the monster repeatedly, causing massive damage as glowing cuts spread across its enormous frame. Hovering above the battlefield, Jin calmly observed the result of his attacks, while the wounded creature struggled to retaliate. Then he landed firmly on the ground and raised his glowing sword for the final strike. Declaring that the battle was over, Jin poured all his remaining strength into one devastating attack. In the next instant, countless blue energy beams erupted through the monster's body and completely sliced it apart. A gigantic blue explosion burst across the middle of the capital, illuminating the entire city. The impact was so enormous that even people near the kingdom's outer walls could see the light. Inside the royal castle, an elderly man and a young girl looked toward the sky in shock after hearing the explosion. The girl nervously asked what was happening, while the older man silently watched with concern. Meanwhile, Jin landed calmly in the ruined streets as the gigantic monster dissolved into green smoke around him. From behind, he heard stunned voices questioning who he really was. 3 days later, the capital had already begun rebuilding after the invasion. Citizens throughout the streets waved respectfully toward Jin whenever they saw him watching from windows or rooftops. Inside his room, Jin stretched lazily and reflected that despite the scale of the attack, the overall damage to the city had been far smaller than expected. Sitting down on the bed, he concluded that most of the credit belonged to the Holy Knights and the kingdom's defenders. Many knights had already been mobilized against giant corruptors before the invasion even began, which allowed the city to recover much faster once the main battle ended. Thanks to the combined efforts of the knights and civilians, order returned quickly. Meanwhile, Harris Academy remained sealed under investigation while guards stood watch around the entrance. Professor Lidman and Lord Erdman, who were suspected of orchestrating the incident, had both been arrested. Several teachers and even members of the academy leadership were also taken into custody for possible involvement. Relaxing against the bed, Jin realized that he technically only spent a single day teaching before the academy shut down completely. Even so, the recent battle left him with a new realization. He was strong enough to defeat groups of enemies, but not strong enough to protect everyone at the same time while fighting monsters across an entire city. To prevent future tragedies, he understood that he needed to become even stronger. With that thought in mind, Jin picked up the blue cube Kagura left behind inside the laboratory. Before he could activate it, however, he heard someone knock at the door. Jin immediately asked who was there. Opening the door, he found the blonde noblewoman standing outside in an elegant dress. Smiling politely, she explained that she had come to escort him somewhere. Then, to his surprise, she addressed him as master. Confused, Jin asked why she personally came instead of sending a servant. The girl explained that her brother wanted to thank him properly and discuss an important matter. According to her, it would be disrespectful to send an ordinary servant to summon someone who had saved the capital. As a representative of the Walton family, she decided to come herself. Jin awkwardly asked whether she had finally stopped calling him an inferior race. With a graceful gesture, the girl admitted that she had reflected deeply on her previous behavior. She now believed that people should not judge others based on appearance and that everyone deserved respect. Because of that, she hoped to continue learning from him. Before Jin could respond, Hakama suddenly appeared beside the doorway. Jin called her name in surprise, while Hakama casually explained that she became bored and came to visit him. The blonde noblewoman immediately became irritated by Hakama's sudden appearance and mockingly referred to her as a potato girl. Jin quickly reminded her that she had supposedly changed her attitude toward others. Soon afterward, the group arrived at the enormous Walton family mansion. The servants welcomed them respectfully, while the butler instructed 2 younger attendants to guide the guests through the estate. Jin noticed how naturally the children handled their duties, and one of them happily led him through the halls. Curious, Jin asked whether they had been harmed during the recent invasion. The child smiled and explained that everyone working in the mansion protected them because the servants there were highly skilled. Relieved, Jin was glad to hear they were being treated well. One of the maids then praised his bravery during the battle in the capital. Jin asked where she heard those stories, and the blonde noblewoman proudly answered that Argus himself spoke about Jin's accomplishments constantly. She even declared that spreading the achievements of her master was part of her duty as his disciple. The statement left Jin completely confused. Turning toward the younger children, The girl encouraged them to follow Jin's example. One of the boys quietly admitted that until recently Miss Milia had always been extremely strict, but lately she seemed very different. Hearing that, Jin silently thought the change in her attitude was surprisingly dramatic. The group eventually climbed a grand staircase and stopped before a large set of doors. The blue-haired maid knocked respectfully and announced the arrival of Master Jin to the people waiting inside. When the doors opened, Jin stepped into the room and immediately found himself facing two men seated within. One of them was an older wolf-eared man whose sharp gaze carried an intimidating sense of authority. Argus invited Jin into the room and asked him to sit down while the younger servants quietly peeked inside with curiosity. Once everyone was seated, Argus apologized for summoning him so suddenly, but Jin casually replied that he did not mind. The armored knight then introduced the older man beside him as Hardin Gunslot, the guild master of the royal capital. Hardin stood up immediately and shook Jin's hand respectfully, saying it was an honor to finally meet him. After sitting down again, the guild master admitted that he personally witnessed Jin's performance during the monster invasion. According to him, if Jin had not stopped the giant creature, the entire kingdom would have faced disaster. He then bowed his head and sincerely thanked Jin on behalf of the nation for saving the capital. Jin calmly replied that he had only defeated the main monster. In his opinion, the Holy Knights and the other defenders deserved just as much gratitude for protecting the citizens. Hardin quietly noted how unusually humble Jin was despite his overwhelming strength. Jin then asked whether that was the only reason they called him there. The answer was no. Hardin revealed that the royal family wished to meet him personally after hearing about the battle. Jin was visibly surprised by the news. However, before discussing the royal summons further, Hardin explained that there was something important he needed clarified first. With a serious expression, the guild master directly asked who Jin truly was. According to Hardin, the guild possessed information networks spread throughout the kingdom. Yet despite extensive investigation, they could not uncover anything about Jin's background. Argus also made it clear that this time he expected honest answers without excuses. The atmosphere inside the room immediately became tense. Milia and Hakama quietly watched as both men stared directly at Jin, waiting for him to respond. After a brief silence, Jin scratched the back of his head and admitted that he had not intentionally hidden the truth. He simply assumed nobody would ever believe a story like his. Argus calmly answered that if the story came from Jin himself, he was willing to believe it. Jin smiled faintly before finally revealing the truth. He explained that he was a human from 100 million years in the past. Argus immediately connected the revelation to the ancient taboo mentioned in Kodama village. He realized Jin was the legendary human sleeping behind the sealed underground door that no one had ever managed to open. Although Hardin admitted the story sounded unbelievable, he stated that he trusted Jin's words. Milia then added that she personally saw the underground laboratory beneath the academy. She described the massive metal door protected by enormous circular locks and confirmed that both the professors and Argus witnessed Jin's abilities firsthand. Argus immediately turned toward his sister in surprise after hearing how casually she exposed the secret. Smiling innocently, Milia simply asked what the problem was while her brother sat there speechless. Jin calmly explained that he had been sleeping underground in that country for an unimaginably long time. His reason for traveling to the capital was to gather information about the current era. Hardin then asked exactly what kind of information Jin was searching for. Jin answered that there were two main objectives. The first involved the Corruptors. He explained that those monsters already existed 100 million years ago, which immediately shocked everyone in the room. However, according to Jin, the creatures should no longer exist in the modern world. Argus questioned why that would be the case. Jin explained that the answer involved the spirits. Long ago, vast numbers of spirits spread across the planet and maintained environmental balance. In the past, humanity created gigantic energy towers capable of spreading purification energy worldwide. The scene flashed back to enormous structures activating and releasing brilliant blue light across the entire planet. From space, the energy spread like a massive wave of light that cleansed the Earth itself. According to Jin, Corruptors could only survive in polluted environments saturated with negative energy. Since spirits purified those regions naturally, the monsters should eventually have lost every place suitable for survival. That was why Jin could not understand how the Corruptors still existed in the present era. Although he admitted he still lacked complete answers, Jin removed the blue cube from his pocket and activated it. A hologram of Kagura appeared and explained that the Corruptors had evolved over time. Hardin stared at the hologram in amazement and immediately recognized it as technology from an ancient civilization. Curious, he asked how such a system functioned, but Jin admitted he could not fully explain the science behind it. Jin then revealed that investigating the capital was necessary because he wanted to learn how modern society fought against the monsters and whether any historical records about them still survived. When Hardin asked about the second objective, Jin explained that he was searching for ancient laboratories scattered around the world. However, he deliberately kept the details about the hidden power upgrades to himself. In the end, Jin stated that everything connected to a single goal. With a determined expression, he declared that he intended to completely erase the Corruptors from the world. Once his explanation ended, silence filled the room. After a moment, Argus admitted that the story sounded unbelievable, while Hardin quietly agreed. Even so, both men accepted Jin's explanation because his goals aligned with their own desire to eliminate the monsters threatening humanity. However, Argus strongly advised Jin never to repeat that story publicly. Jin smiled confidently and replied that he already understood. If he told ordinary people the truth, they would simply think he was insane. Argus asked for Hardin's opinion on the matter, and the guild master calmly replied that if Argus trusted Jin, then he would trust him as well. He also pointed out that someone with evil intentions would never risk his own life to protect the royal castle and save the capital. After hearing that, the atmosphere inside the room finally relaxed, and the three men seemed to reach an understanding. Just then, the maid and the young servant boy entered the room and apologized for interrupting. The maid explained that the appointed time was approaching, causing Argus to realize it was already time to leave. With a smile, he told Jin and the others to prepare themselves. Although Jin looked slightly confused by the sudden request, he agreed anyway. Sometime later, a luxurious carriage raced along the road, leading toward the royal castle. Inside the vehicle, Jin quietly stared out the window while thinking about the fact that he was about to meet the kingdom's royalty. Dressed in an elegant formal suit, he questioned whether changing clothes had really been necessary at all. Argus immediately replied that the outfit suited him surprisingly well, while Hardin agreed with the compliment. Milia and Hakama also praised Jin's appearance, though Jin complained that the clothes made it difficult to move comfortably. Hardin then explained that the person they were about to meet was the first prince, who was currently acting as ruler due to the king's illness. According to him, maintaining appearances at court was extremely important. Jin silently decided that the entire situation felt like a troublesome waste of time. As the carriage approached the castle gates, he could only hope the meeting would not create even more problems. Inside the castle, rows of heavily armed knights stood waiting for their arrival. The royal guard consisted of many different races, but every single one of them carried the presence of an elite warrior. Soon, the group entered the grand throne room. Argus respectfully announced that he had brought the man responsible for saving the kingdom during the recent attack. From the throne above, a powerful voice ordered them to raise their heads. Argus, Hardin, and the others knelt respectfully while Jin slowly lifted his gaze toward the ruler before him. Sitting upon the throne was the first prince, Tails Kamoja, whose posture radiated confidence and authority. Jin calmly introduced himself as Shidō Jin. The prince responded with little more than a dismissive grunt. Speaking on behalf of his sick father, Tails formally thanked Jin for his contribution in defending the kingdom. He then mentioned hearing from Argus that Jin came from the small village of Kodama. With open mockery in his voice, the prince commented that it was surprising someone so powerful originated from such an insignificant place. Then his expression darkened. Without bothering to hide his intentions, the prince directly ordered Jin to become his loyal servant. He demanded that Jin join the Holy Knights and devote himself entirely to serving the kingdom. The declaration echoed heavily throughout the throne room. As his red eyes glowed ominously, the prince repeated the order with obvious arrogance. Jin immediately disliked the proposal, and anger flickered in his eyes. Noticing the silence, the prince impatiently asked why Jin had not answered. Hardin quickly attempted to intervene and reminded the prince that Jin had been summoned there as an honored guest, not as a subordinate forced into service. Before the conversation could escalate further, Jin calmly interrupted and explained that he had no intention of remaining in the country permanently. The prince brought up Jin's position at the academy, but Jin clarified that the teaching job was only temporary. The nobleman then directly asked whether this meant Jin was refusing the offer. Jin calmly answered yes and apologized for declining. The atmosphere instantly shifted. The prince coldly replied that, in that case, there was nothing more to discuss. Immediately, the knights throughout the throne room drew their weapons. At the prince's command, they surrounded Jin and prepared to capture him. Hardin was stunned by the sudden order and tried to stop the guards, but several knights restrained him before he could interfere. The prince then accused Jin of attempting to overthrow the state. Everyone in the room was shocked by the accusation. Tales explained that a dangerous corruptor had been hidden behind the sealed underground door beneath the academy. Since Jin opened that door himself, the prince claimed it was only natural to suspect him. With a cruel smile, he even suggested that Jin saving the kingdom might have been part of a larger act. Hardin angrily denounced the accusation as absurd and excessive. Meanwhile, Jin remained completely silent despite the countless weapons pointed directly at him. The prince smugly stated that if Jin had simply agreed to serve him obediently, he would have ignored all suspicion. However, because Jin refused, the situation supposedly left him with no other choice. Argus remained bowed to the ground as his thoughts raced. Jin had only arrived in the city recently, so there was no way he could have been involved. Argus had already informed them that he was the one who asked him to investigate the academy. Only now did he realize he had been deceived. Looking back, the deployment of the guards should have made it obvious. The captains of the 3rd and 4th squads were fanatics devoted entirely to the first prince, men willing to carry out any unreasonable order if it suited the prince's wishes. From the beginning, they had planned to eliminate the protagonist the moment he refused. The prince looked at Jin and stated that a man capable of defeating a giant corruptor was far too dangerous to leave unchecked. Pretending to show mercy, he offered him one final chance and, with a mocking smile, ordered him to swear loyalty to him. Surrounded by soldiers with weapons aimed in his direction, Jin stayed silent for a moment before calmly admitting that he did not understand. Confused, the prince questioned what he meant. Jin pointed out that, in a situation like this, a verbal oath meant nothing. Even if he spoke the words now, he could simply escape later, making the vow worthless. Beside him, Argus, still kneeling on the ground, realized that the argument was true. Jin continued, saying it seemed less like the prince wanted loyalty and more like he simply wanted to hear the words spoken aloud. He admitted he had been wondering whether this was only about satisfying the prince's need to control others, or if there was something more hidden behind it. Hearing those words, the prince's expression twisted with anger. One of the nearby knights immediately exploded in anger and demanded to know how Jin dared speak to royalty in such a manner. Jin smirked faintly and casually grabbed the tip of the soldier's spear. With a simple motion, he applied pressure to the weapon, instantly shocking the knight, stared in confusion, unable to understand the overwhelming strength Jin possessed. Then, with a single step forward, Jin shattered the stone floor beneath him. The knight froze in disbelief. At that moment, Jin calmly declared that he was the one speaking now. In the next instant, he hurled the knight into the air with terrifying force. The prince watched in shock, unable to believe what he was seeing unfold inside his own throne room. Meanwhile, Argus placed a hand over his face in frustration as the situation completely spiraled out of control. The leader of the 3rd Division angrily attempted to activate her spirit magic against Jin. To her horror, the magic failed completely. Panicking, she immediately ordered the other guards to capture him. One knight lunged forward with a spear, but Jin effortlessly blocked the attack. With a swift kick, he launched the soldier into the air and sent him crashing violently across the room. Throughout the entire exchange, Jin maintained a calm expression as though none of it required any effort. A moment later, a massive burst of air pressure exploded outward from his body and threw the remaining knights backward. Furious, the prince shouted that allowing someone with such dangerous strength to roam freely would threaten the kingdom itself. However, as the dust settled, confusion spread through the throne room. Jin had vanished. Argus immediately searched the room, while the prince continued insisting that his actions were meant to protect the people. Then a voice echoed through the lingering smoke. Jin calmly stated that he also wanted to protect the people living in this era. Suddenly, he appeared directly behind the prince. The ruler froze in terror the moment he realized Jin was standing at his back. With a cold expression, Jin warned that he had no mercy for truly corrupt people. He then quietly asked the prince which side he truly belonged to. The prince immediately understood that his life was completely in Jin's hands. Nearby, the female captain furiously pointed her sword toward Jin and demanded to know whether he understood what he was doing. Jin calmly replied that he did. With a firm voice, he explained that he was resisting people trying to force something completely unreasonable upon him. The fallen Horn Knight angrily accused him of opposing the kingdom itself. Jin immediately rejected the accusation. Facing everyone in the throne room, the silver-haired warrior stated that they were the ones creating this conflict, not him. Hardin silently watched the confrontation grow more dangerous while Jin continued speaking. Jin explained that he would willingly show respect to true royalty. However, he would only offer his help if the nation acted fairly and if its rulers made reasonable decisions deserving of trust. The commander listened carefully as Jin warned everyone in the throne room that he was not the kind of person who would silently accept unreasonable demands. The injured guard glared at him angrily, while Jin calmly added that if people tried to force him into something, they could not complain when he resisted. Then his tone shifted slightly. Jin leaned closer to the prince and quietly said he wanted to ask him one simple question first. Near the prince's ear, he calmly asked whether he truly believed everything in the world would always go exactly the way he wanted. The blonde ruler immediately began sweating as Jin's frightening voice echoed beside him. At that moment, Jin's eyes glowed blue, releasing an intimidating pressure throughout the throne room. Before the tension could explode further, however, the enormous doors of the hall suddenly opened. Everyone turned toward the entrance. Elegant footsteps echoed across the chamber as a calm female voice remarked that she had heard the entire conversation. A beautiful silver-haired young woman entered the throne room with a gentle smile and politely asked whether she could join the discussion as well. The guards instinctively stepped aside for her despite their confusion. The Horn Commander immediately lowered his head respectfully after recognizing her. Meanwhile, Argus quietly sighed in relief, realizing she had arrived in time to stop the situation from spiraling completely out of control. Jin quickly understood that the woman before him was the kingdom's powerful second princess. Charlotte smiled lightly and teased her older brother by commenting that he seemed to be enjoying himself quite a lot. The prince glared at her furiously and spoke her name with obvious irritation. Her sudden interference clearly infuriated him. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately after her arrival, and even the nights seemed less tense. Charlotte calmly scolded her brother for holding such an important meeting without inviting her. With a playful smile, she also reminded him that he was not even the official representative of their father yet. The prince clenched his teeth in frustration at the provocation. Trying to regain control of the situation, he argued that Jin was not a true hero at all. Instead, he accused Jin of being a dangerous criminal who had openly defied the royal family. The female captain immediately supported the accusation and stated that Jin had injured one of the commanders. Charlotte calmly questioned whether that only happened because the commander acted rudely first. The Horn Commander quickly defended himself by claiming Jin had threatened the first prince directly. Charlotte tilted her head slightly and asked whether Jin had not simply been standing behind her brother without attacking him. Then she turned toward Jin with a smile and asked if that was correct. Jin calmly confirmed that he only approached to ask a question. Charlotte immediately looked back toward her brother and repeated Jin's explanation word for word. With clear amusement, she asked whether he truly intended to call someone a criminal over something so trivial. The prince trembled with anger but found himself unable to answer her directly. Charlotte then shifted her attention back toward Jin and addressed him respectfully by his full name. With a graceful curtsy, she explained that unlike her brother, she had no intention of demanding loyalty from him as a servant. Instead, she simply asked whether he would be willing to help the kingdom as a friend. Jin smiled slightly and accepted the proposal. Charlotte seemed genuinely pleased by his answer and thanked him warmly. She then suggested changing locations since the throne room was clearly no longer suitable for a peaceful discussion. Using her authority, she ordered the knights to escort her new guest safely. The guards immediately obeyed and stepped aside to clear a path for Jin. Meanwhile, the first prince sat frozen with rage, unable to stop any of it. Some time later, a carriage departed from the castle grounds. Inside, Argus admitted that the situation in the throne room had genuinely frightened him. He asked Jin why he provoked the prince so directly. Jin casually replied that he only pushed things a little. However, he quietly admitted that he sensed something strange coming from the prince. Although he hoped it was merely his imagination, deep down he knew the dark feeling he sensed had been very real. Elsewhere in the carriage, Charlotte smiled gently and told Jin that he did not need to thank her since he had already saved the kingdom before. She apologized for her brother's behavior, though Jin replied that it was unnecessary. With a friendly smile, she introduced herself properly as Charlotte Kamoja, the second princess of the kingdom. She then asked Jin once more to continue supporting them as a trusted friend, and he accepted calmly. Argus questioned why the prince acted so aggressively earlier, but Charlotte admitted she did not fully understand his exact motives either. Still, she explained that her brother was an extremely ambitious man who dreamed of expanding the kingdom through war once he inherited the throne. Hearing that, Jin quickly realized why the prince viewed him as a threat. Someone powerful enough to oppose unnecessary wars would become a major obstacle to those ambitions. Charlotte then assured Jin that she would not allow her brother to interfere with him again. She also revealed that Hardin was already preparing a full report for the king, who remained bedridden due to illness. After a brief pause, Charlotte admitted something even more important. She had no intention of allowing her brother to inherit the throne peacefully. With a serious expression, she asked Jin whether he truly believed her words. Jin smiled calmly and answered yes. Back inside the carriage, Argus finally asked where they were heading. Charlotte explained that summoning the kingdom's savior without offering proper gratitude would be extremely rude. She also mentioned hearing that Jin was currently staying at a very ordinary inn. Eventually, the carriage arrived at its destination. Charlotte stepped out looking unusually excited. With a bright smile, she announced that they had prepared a special gift for him.